Welcome to In Conversation with Brad Wendes. This week we've got another weekly update. It's been a very, very interesting week, both in terms of my stuff and also national politics. It's been fascinating. So we've got guests coming again next week. Got some great guests lined up, some really interesting topics. This week I'm going to give you a short rundown of the week on what's going on here. I'm now 15 weeks into creating content for YouTube and for Spotify. And as I kind of thought at the beginning, making long form content like the hour or sometimes even 90-minute videos on YouTube is asking a lot of the audience. I'm asking you guys to sit down and listen to me and someone else have a conversation for an hour, hour and a half is a big ask. So the fact that that's taken off as well as it has is amazing. I'm actually surprised at how well the channel has done on YouTube compared with Spotify. On YouTube, we've got 88,500 views in 15 weeks, which just blows my mind. Got over 120 subscribers now, and that kind of accelerated a little bit with what happened this week, which I'll get into very shortly. I've been putting out 2 videos a day, sometimes a little bit more, and one long-form video every Friday at 1 p.m. GMT. And those have been the long conversations and interviews, and there was my story, and then there was some information on podcasting in general. And I was very fortunate this week that I put out a short on British politics, just an off-the-cuff short on how archaic British politics is and some of the conventions that we have in British Parliament, which are hundreds and hundreds of years old. That comment on British politics came out the day before a Prime Minister announced the general election. So that video got like 1,000 views in the first hour, hit 10,000 views in the first couple of days. Over 60 comments, lots and lots of likes, because it's a time that British politics was in the media, in the news, and people are searching for content around British politics. Fantastic. It also gave me some feedback because people were commenting and people were having conversations around it. And it was really interesting to see what kind of content's done very well. And as I thought would be the case when I started this channel, I'm kind of finding a niche. I'm finding where the audience are interested, what things people are interested in, the things that we have knowledge on. And really the 2 areas that do the best are talking about culture. So as a older millennial man, as a guy in my 40s who has a family, and I'm a business owner, talking about how the world affects me and our perceptions on the world. So speaking to Chris Phillips about millennial dads on gender identity was a really interesting conversation. And it's one that did very well. Talking about British politics, and British politics from my perspective has been really, really well received. So I think I'm going to have a look at what I think has gone on this week and see what you guys think of that conversation. I initially thought that this channel would be audio first. It's made to be listened to. It's a conversation. It's me talking or me talking to someone else. But Spotify hasn't really picked up in the same way YouTube has. I mean, YouTube has exploded, relatively speaking, for a brand new channel. Whereas on Spotify, we've got like a maximum of 290 plays of the long form content and looking at about 13 subscribers compared with the 10 times that on YouTube and 88,500 views on YouTube across long form and shorts. And the highest viewed long form video on YouTube is over 300 views, where you're looking at, I think, 50 or 60 on Spotify. So I am really surprised that for an audio first piece of content, it's taken off so much better on YouTube. And I think that makes me look at YouTube as a platform that pushes content to new users in a more efficient and effective way than something like Spotify. I think with Spotify, you have to go looking for it, or you have to be interested in something similar. And it doesn't really push that content in the same way that YouTube does. YouTube's just pushing content at you all the time. And if it thinks you're interested, it'll throw this at you, which has been great for this channel. So this week, our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, announced a general election. General election is going to be on the 4th of July. And I know there's a lot of Independence Day jokes made about that. But it's interesting because I was saying last year to anyone who cared to listen that I thought we were going to get a May general election. I was looking at the cost of living and interest rates. I'm looking at what's going on in the world, or in the world of Britain. And I'm thinking living standards aren't going to get any better this year. Any changes that are made in policy aren't really going to have a knock-on effect. If anything, things are probably going to get a little bit worse before they get better. So I didn't understand why the government was holding on, and people were talking about a November or possibly, announcing in December for a general election. And I couldn't figure out why, for any other reason than for the party to hang on to power for longer. And then the general election was announced for the 4th of July. And I thought that tracks, it's going to be before the summer recess. It's going to be turned around really quickly. It's taken the opposition by surprise. But I'm thinking, why now? Why announce it so suddenly? There wasn't really any chatter about it. It did take a lot of people by surprise. And whether that be because Rishi Sunak thought that People were putting in letters of no confidence against him. Was he upsetting the party? Was his polling getting any worse? Is he just done? And I don't really know why he's hanging on. The guy is incredibly wealthy. Why not just go, yeah, see you later. I'll walk, and let it be someone else's problem. I'm, fair play to him for sticking around, even though he's deeply unpopular at a time when the country's not really having the best time economically. And then they've gone and announced these wacky policies this week. Well, we haven't got any manifestos about what people are going to be voting for on the 4th of July. We are hearing some snips of what kind of policies are going to come through. And the big one this week that people have been talking about is the Conservative government talking about reintroducing national service. Now, that as a concept is quite interesting, because national service was introduced in 1947 by Clement Attlee, who was quite the socialist. It was a Labour prime minister who came in 1945 after the Second World War. We haven't had national service in the UK since 1960. But the fact that it was introduced by Clement Attlee, who started the NHS, who introduced subsidised housing, the council housing and social housing, and was talking about turning to socialism because charities couldn't do enough to get people out of the slums and deal with the inequality in the country. And the only way to do it was look at a wealth transfer from the wealthy to the poor in the UK. And that began this kind of period of relative prosperity in this country, at least, with social housing, with the NHS and that welfare state that saw unemployment plummet, where people were protected and were safe in their lives, and more people went on to have safe, secure homes and were fed. I mean, yes, we still had rationing for a period of that, and the world was a different place then. We're talking about the recovery from the Second World War. So economically and across the world, things were very, very different. But it's interesting that that was a policy that was introduced by quite a socialist prime minister that's now being adopted by a relatively right-leaning party. So yeah, it was an interesting observation. And I, as a person, as an individual, I'm not averse to a little bit of giving back. And I'm not averse to the concept of people doing some of their civic duty. I think the way that this has been suggested, introduced, is problematic, though, and I don't know this is the right time for it. And there's a few issues that I personally have. I'm not an economist. I'm not a political commentator. I'm just a guy talking about what I think of this. But talking about 18-year-olds having to do a year of national service is interesting in the current climate, and then the rules that they're talking about introducing to that. So the first one being that while it's mandatory, it's not a criminal offence to not do it. And I personally think that any crime to which the punishment is a fixed penalty, a fine, simply means that it's okay for rich people to do it. You look at parking in and around the City of London, where you've got Lamborghinis and Ferraris just parked wherever they want because the fine is so affordable to some of these incredibly wealthy people that it doesn't matter. Park wherever they want and they'll just pay the fine because they can, in a way that a poor person would be financially crippled by 100, 150, 200 pound fine. That's chump change to some of these people. And the same with even simple driving offences. If you're caught speeding and you haven't been caught speeding in the previous 2 or 3 years, then you get the opportunity to go on a speed awareness course. A speed awareness course means that you don't get any points, you don't get any penalty points on your license, and you don't have to necessarily declare that to your insurance company, and you can continue to drive with a clean license despite having been caught speeding. The cost of the course is more than the cost of the fine. So those who are wealthier can do the course instead of taking the fine. It disproportionately affects poorer people. And any of these things, anything with a fixed penalty, just means that poor people have got to follow that law and rich people don't have to. I was speaking to a magistrate this week. I might even get Glenn on the show because I think he's going to have some interesting things to talk about. Anyway, and he was a former magistrate, and he said, well, you do have the option of, when something goes to court, paying a percentage of income. And I think that's a much better way of managing these kind of things, because if a billionaire had to pay tens of thousands of pounds every time they drove a bit too fast, it might put them off doing it. Whereas £60, £100 is nothing to someone who's making more than that before they've even woken up in the morning. They've made more than that with one bite of cornflakes. So, but that requires having to take someone to court and assess their income. And there's a whole lot of paperwork and rigmarole that goes alongside with that. And I'm sure there'd be ways of gaming the system. So it's not a perfect answer, but it certainly is an answer. Anyway, back to the concept of national service. So rich people won't have to do it because there'll be a fine. So if they don't want to do it, they won't have to. Military service, of which there are only 30,000 spaces for the year per year, will be paid. So it's 12 months of military service. That's an interesting one because at a time when arguably the government isn't doing a huge amount for young people, I don't think that young people haven't got a lot of skin in the game. You know, why would an 18-year-old that looks like the government's given up on him, who can't afford to pay the fine to not have to do national service? It's conscription. You know, that's what it is. Making these people join the military to fight for a country they don't necessarily believe in. And then the other positions, the other sort of civic positions, so fire service, ambulance, St. John's Ambulance, and even other community organisations that were being tossed around, were unpaid. So it's being weekend work, unpaid. And I'm all for volunteering. You know, I work in a sector where we rely on volunteers to do youth work and to work with people, but I do believe in paying people. But at a time when a lot of young people have got second or third jobs and side hustles just to pay the rent, just to pay the bills, you can't possibly ask them to work their weekends unpaid. You just can't. It's not right. Once again, it disproportionately affects poorer people who need to have those second and third jobs just to eat and keep a roof over themselves. Whereas someone from a wealthier family could afford to give up the weekends and might enjoy doing a bit of volunteering, but not if it's mandated. So while I'm not averse to civic duty and civic service, I don't think that this is particularly well implemented, but that's just my thoughts. Also, the national service scheme is going to cost £2.5 billion, which while they have costed it and they have said it's coming out of this, it's coming out of that, I'm not sure that I would vote for that policy as a good use of money. I think that there are issues with young people that need to be tackled. I don't think that conscription is the way to do it. Now, this isn't a manifesto. They're just talking about ideas now. We're only a few days into the election campaign. But Kier Starmer sitting and being interviewed and not even confirming that he would increase taxes on the wealthiest 5% of society, which would bring in a lot of additional income. Wealth tax in a time where we've had the largest transfer of wealth from poor to the wealthy in modern history, certainly since wartime, and that return to that huge inequality that we saw before 1930s, to not tax the rich or to not increase taxation on the ultra wealthy. I'm not talking about you who's got £1 million house because you bought it in 1960 for 10p and a bag of beans or whatever. I'm talking about people who make more money from their assets than you could ever dream of seeing. I'm talking about the incredibly wealthy people who don't have to go to work. They should be taxed on their wealth, and wealth taxes needs a reform, needs to be looked at. Someone like our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who declared around £2 million of income and looks like he's paid around 23% income tax last year. People look at that and go, oh, that's probably about right. You know, he's a little bit less than the average person, but, you know, £2 million income. No, he's got assets to like somewhere around the region of £700 million. He's just chosen to release enough to show that he's got a bit of income and pay a bit of tax so that he can't be criticised too heavily. It would have been a choice for him to declare that amount of money because that's what these incredibly wealthy people can do. So anyway, Labour not committing to taxing the ultra wealthy was an interesting flex. And in an interview, Kier Starmer said, I'm not sure we can afford to do that. What do you mean you can't afford to increase income through taxation? Like, who's pulling the strings here? So that's going to be interesting to see what their manifesto looks like when you've jumped from the previous Labour leader, who was incredibly left-leaning in Jeremy Corbyn, right over to Kier Starmer. And arguably there's not a huge amount between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. We don't have a two-party system in the UK. We do have other parties, but really that's the main opposition. So to see there's not a huge amount between them economically, it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the general election. I'm fascinated by British politics at the moment because it's going to be a wacky year. Interesting, the only demographic who have majority support for the Conservative government are the over 70s. Even as you get into like 60 to 70, it kind of flits around a little bit. My prediction is that this year we're going to see a huge rise in independent candidates because I think generally the public are disillusioned with politics and the two-party system. I think there's a lot of people that are unhappy with their quality of life after 14 years of Conservative government, but they're looking at Labour as not really a viable alternative. So I think we might even see a hung parliament, but we're certainly going to see the current Conservative government out. Are we going to see a Labour government? Probably. Is there going to be a fundamental change in the way that we live our lives and the quality of life we have? Probably not. In fact, if anything, they're going to have to dig us out of a hole, and things are probably going to get worse before they get better. And it's terrifying that what we could have is an ineffective Labour government for 5 years, and then a huge resurgence of the right, and suddenly we're back in 1930s Germany. And that's genuinely terrifying, that we could see extreme right-wing parties coming in with very, very scary politics off the back of 5 years of an ineffective Labour government. So it really is a worrying time, certainly as a parent to a young child, and what the world's going to do. So I really hope that a lot of people go out and vote this year and vote for what matters to you. And if that's an independent candidate, then so be it. There's been another interesting talking point this week about Labour wanting to reduce the voting age down to 16. And I've heard people complaining about this, saying that's ridiculous. 16-year-olds aren't responsible. Are 18-year-olds responsible? Are 21-year-olds responsible? Where do you draw the line? And I understand that line's been drawn at 18. I feel that while you can join the military at 16 should be the voting age. That's my personal opinion. I think if you can sign up and fight and die for your country, you should at least have some say in who's governing it. Whether that be that if you've signed up to the military, you get to vote to 16, I don't know. But I don't have an issue with reducing the voting age to 16. I think we need a bit of reform in the voting in this country. But once again, it's one of those issues where you're not going to get electoral reform from the party who got into power from the current system. So it's unlikely to be changed. And it looks like even Labour aren't talking about massive reform. They're not talking about reform of the House of Lords anymore, which they were previously. So again, it's going to be a very, very interesting time. Looking forward to seeing what the manifestos are in the coming weeks. And I think young people are probably quite disillusioned at the moment. And I can understand that, because we're living in a time where the options for young people and the life that they would expect, or the life their parents and grandparents have got, just isn't a possibility. Just having a look at some stats here. Housing costs from 1950 into the 1920s, the average house price was two times the average income in the UK. Okay, these stats are from Schroders, so they're an investment company, and they're tracking, the cost of assets over the years when they're giving investment advice. Not some crazy left-wing political stats I'm pulling up here. This is from an investment company. From the 1940s into the 1990s, house prices kind of flitted between 4 times and 6 times average household income. So, went up and went down, and there were some crashes and booms in that time. But 4 and 6 times your average household income. So, from fairly affordable into a little bit less affordable. But 6 was a high. Between the 1990s and the 2020s, it's gone from an average of 4 to 6 times to 10 times the average income. If the average income is £32,000, we're looking at an average house price of just shy of £300,000. In London and South East, that goes up to an average of 12 times the income. So when you're talking about, work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get a house, this is not possible for these young people, especially young people from poorer households, or young people that don't have support from families that have had to move out, because then they're paying enormous rents, because the cost of housing isn't just the cost of mortgages, it's the cost of living somewhere. And if buy-to-let landlords have bought a house and their mortgage has gone through the roof, or the cost of their house is higher, then that's passed on, because these people want to make a profit on it. So we definitely need some sort of reform of the housing sector, both in terms of mortgage houses and rental, because it's just simply not affordable, and people can't dig themselves out of these. And I don't say that as someone who's like, well, free housing for everyone. I'm looking at what happens in another 30, 40, 50 years. If you've got a generation of people that are renting now, and then these people are going to need to be looked after in their old age, well, that's going to fall on the state, isn't it? Because they don't have assets. Previously, you bought your house, you paid off your mortgage, you live in your house, you sell your house, and there's an asset that's going to pay for your care in old age. You don't have any assets. Who's going to pay for your care? Your family? Well, no, because they're too busy working 3 jobs just to pay for their own existence. And they're working later because the age of retirement's gone up. So suddenly you've got no care within the community. So it's going to have to fall on the state. And we're going to have enormous costs for care for the elderly in another couple of decades if we don't start looking at this housing crisis now. So that's my thoughts on the politics going on at the moment. As I say, our political videos have done the best of any, so I thought I'd just have a chat about what's going on this week and my thoughts on those things. And finish on a slightly happier note. This afternoon, I popped over to Kube Studios, which is a brand new podcast studio in Chelmsford. I feel like I should have recorded this here. I got there and I was chatting to the guys. I was like, man, I should have recorded today's episode here because it's great. But I'm not. I'm here in my office with Spider Brad and the lights and the LEDs as ever. Kube Studios, just superb. It's they've got 4 studios. They've got an audio only, so they've got a radio studio, and they've got 3 different spaces. They've got like your standard streaming space with a lovely backdrop that's a single mic on a desk that you could use for any of your talking to camera stuff like this. This is where I should have recorded this. And they've got a couple of interview spaces, one that's a little bit more formal with a larger table, and then a slightly more comfortable space that's got some armchairs. Amazing sound and video equipment. They've got production support on site. This isn't sponsored, by the way. I was really impressed by the place, and I wish that I had recorded this episode there. So I'll stick a link down in the description about Kube Studios, but really worth checking out. So the guys have got some production support, so they can give you a tech to do stuff. They even offer editing support. So if you want to get into podcasting, you could just go down there and someone will record it, and then they'll edit it, and you can put it out yourself. And brilliant. And their editing costs and the studio hire really wasn't that expensive. I think the studio I wanted to use was looking at like £65 for 90 minutes. And then an extra 20 quid if I want a tech, and £75 if I want them to edit the episode for me. So you're looking at somewhere in the region of £150, £160 for me to just walk in, record my podcast, and then they'll give me an edited thing. If you've got some sponsorships and you've got some income coming in, that's not a huge amount to pay. For someone like me that's putting out daily and weekly videos, it's not really affordable for me to do every episode there, and I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. But I think I'm going to do a few interviews there because the space is really nice, and it's a local small business, and I believe in supporting small business. So those guys have got some trade off me. But if any sponsors want to come on board and pay for me to use their space, that would be great too, because at the moment I'm just still doing this for the love. Okay, well that's my roundup of the week. I have got some interesting guests. I'm looking forward to Ollie Medlicott coming on. He's a theatre producer, writer, musical guy. The most interesting conversation I want to have with Ollie is that he recently revealed to me that he thinks the Star Wars sequel trilogy is good. So we'll discuss that. We'll discuss that in detail. I've also got Dom Fenton, whose podcast I went on this week. I went on the Power of the Hobby, or Power of Hobbies podcast, and he's going to come here, and we're going to have a chat next week. So I think that's going to be next week's episode. I've also got Scott Jackson, Dr. Scott Jackson, who's a chiropractor, qualified chiropractor, who's opened a parkour gym, who used to do some work with Red Bull in free running, parkour and acrobatics. So really, really interesting guy. Also recently became a father, and is someone in the world who I think is one of the people I look up to the most and admire the most, and the person I ask for advice from the most. So Scott, I'm really looking forward to having him on. If you are interested in coming on the podcast, if you've got an interesting story to tell, let me know. I'm open to guests, remote or in person. Politics, social issues, these things have done very well. I'm really interested in speaking to other creators. So if you want to come on the podcast and tell me your story, drop me a message. Anyway, have a great week, guys, and I'll see you again next week for another interview. Bye-bye.